Good evening, everyone. My name is Bren Carlil, and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. Welcome to another ZFA Conversation. Tonight, we are very lucky to be hosting Sarah Tuttle Singer, who'll be discussing life in Jerusalem and her book, Jerusalem Drawn and Quartered. However, before I introduce her, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which people are watching this. And now to our guest. Sarah was raised in California before making Aliyah in 2010. 6 years later, she decided to live for a year within Jerusalem's old city walls, 3 months in each quarter. As someone who has had an endless fascination with the old city, I think a year living there, getting to know both its people and its secrets is a wonderful idea, and I'm all sorts of jealous. Sarah will be speaking about those experiences, which she captured in her book, Jerusalem Drawn and Quartered, as well as her forthcoming book about the many conversations she's held and the wisdoms she's garnered from Jerusalem's taxi drivers. When she's not exploring the old city, Sarah is the new media editor of the Times of Israel and writes a regular column therein, as well as in many other publications. She'll be speaking tonight with one of my favorite people, Emily Gian, who is the Director of Communications at the ZFA. So without further ado, Emily.
Thank you, Bren, and thank you so much, Sarah, for coming in to speak with us this evening. I am a really huge fan, so I feel like I'm fangirling a little bit. So I hope that our audience will just indulge me in just like totally fanning out over the next hour. First, was just usually we start off, because we started these series during our lockdown, and our lockdown's obviously gone on a bit longer than the rest of the world. I usually like to ask people, where has the last year found you?
That's a great question. The last year has found me somewhere between climbing the walls and also scaling walls. It's been a rough year. In December, I was diagnosed with COVID-19 before people in my age bracket were able to be vaccinated. And I got hit pretty hard with it and have continued to battle some of the long-term and lingering effects. But having gone through it and then having been vaccinated, I've gotten to enjoy that sudden surge in coming back into the world. And I remember the day that Israel undid our mask mandate outside. We've since gone back to it a little bit, but this was back in, it was in April. And we were allowed to take our masks off. And I saw more smiles in 10 minutes than I had seen in an entire year from strangers. And there was just this exquisite, spectacular lightness all around, and I loved it. And since things have eased up a bit, and as I began to feel more secure just in the vaccine, and also having been sick, I've been able to go see my family in the States. I hadn't seen them in a long time, and my dad's 82, and it was just wonderful to be with him again. And I hope the same will be true for everyone in Australia who have family members far flung across the world. And I can't wait for all of you to be able to come over here and get to spend time with us here in Israel, especially come check out Jerusalem and look me up when you're in town.
I feel like, firstly, like about what you said about the mask really resonates, and it would resonate with the Victorian people that are online tonight, because we just removed our masks outdoor yesterday. And I felt exactly the same walking through the streets. Like, I felt like I'm probably not a natural smile on my face person. And I felt like I'm just smiling at everyone. And then the same true when you just said you had the chance to go to the States. And I thought about even the same thing yesterday. Like, I saw a cousin who was able to come to Melbourne from Sydney, which is not far, well, from New South Wales, which is an hour flight, but we have been locked out even from them for many months now. And it just makes me think about how special it will be once we get to Israel and we get to, a lot of people on, everyone here that's sort of involved with the ZFA would have that same longing for Israel. And that kind of leads me, sorry, you go.
Oh, that's fine, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, it kind of leads me to my next thing, because I just read your book, and for anybody that hasn't read the Jerusalem Drawn and Quartered, it is a must read. And the thing, I read it over the weekend, and I just, and I'm not even such a big Jerusalem person, although when I come, you're going to show me. But I just felt like it made me feel so nostalgic. Like I felt like you took us through Jerusalem in such a way that was, and just the descriptions, I felt like I was there, and I have to really commend you on that because it was really beautiful. So I just wanted to ask you, because maybe not everyone has read the book yet, like how your love story, not necessarily with Jerusalem, because we'll get to that, but how your love story with Israel began and how you ended up living in Israel.
I love being asked this question because when I tell it, I get to relive that feeling. And first of all, Emily, thank you for the beautiful things you said about my book. And I'm glad that it was an evocative experience for you in reading it. I'm very drawn to texture and to sound and to scent. And I really wanted that to come through in the book. And it's hard to describe how something smells on a page or even on film, but I did my best, and I'm glad that it seemed to resonate. So my love story with Jerusalem and with Israel was the most unexpected thing for me. I was 15, about to turn 16, and it was just before summer. And I had big plans to have the most, wonderful, typical Los Angeles summer imaginable. I would, highlight my hair with sun in. I'd go to the mall. I'd wait for Matt Cardenas to pick up the phone and ask me out. I'd cover up my bikini under a big Nirvana t-shirt. It's sort of the thing that a lot of girls of my age were doing back in the mid 90s. But my mom actually had other plans for me. She wanted me to have an original summer. So I remember she called me into her office, and she was sitting there at her library desk, this 1920s antique oak table that she had scrounged for at a trash and treasure shop around the block. And she's sitting there smoking her cigarettes and drinking her coffee, and she's fixing me with her gaze. She had these dark brown eyes and this penetrating stare. And I felt like I was in trouble. So I said to her, okay, what did I do? And she said, it's not what you did, it's what you're about to do. And you're going to Israel this summer. And to be honest, it was the last thing I wanted to do. I wanted that typical American summer at the mall. But my mom was adamant. She had been to Israel in 1967, just a few weeks after the Six-Day War. And she had this experience walking through the old city and smelling the spices and the rose water from the hookah pipes and hearing the clang of the merchants' coins in their hands. And she saw a camel go through Damascus Gate. And so that was still in her mind. And my great grandmother had been in Israel years and years before. She was helping her family build communities outside of the old city. And her job was supposed to be to babysit the many children of Menachem Mendel Rand, her uncle. But instead, she went off and had this love affair with an Ottoman official on a rooftop overlooking, the old city, and didn't go down very well with her family, who sent her back to Poland and then to Chicago to keep her away from her new paramour. But that's how she met my great grandfather in Chicago. So I knew those stories too, and that was part of my family history. But again, I didn't feel that connection with Israel at the time. I knew Israel from the map. I knew Israel from the prayer books. I knew Israel from family stories, but not through my own hands or through my own eyes. And so I was skeptical, but my mom was stubborn. She put me on the plane with a bunch of other Jewish teenagers from LA, and I landed. And it turns out that my mom was right. I fell in love. I mean, we have to be real about my mom for a minute. She was going hard about the camel through Damascus Gate and my great grandmother's experiences in Jerusalem, but she forgot to mention the most important part: the hot Israeli soldiers. And I was a young teenager from LA, on my own, really, for the first time. Okay, we had counselors, but they were just a few years older than us, and they knew when to get involved, and they also, bless them, knew when to look the other way. And it was this summer of freedom, but it was also more than that. I don't want to be too flippant. It was also, for the first time in my entire life, when the pieces of my identity came together, when I didn't have to explain why I kissed that thing on the door, or why I don't eat pepperoni pizza or shrimp tempura, even though all my friends love it, or why, even if Matt Cardenas were to call me up and ask me out for a Friday night, I couldn't go because I'd be celebrating Shabbat with my family. It was the first time when all of it came together. And as my mother had promised me, when she said to me that Israel would resonate, all around me, I saw these people who were passionate, full of life, full of joy, okay, argumentative and sometimes pushy and a little rude, but also just warm and caring. And it was like being surrounded by family. And that's how I fell in love.
It's so, you know what, I feel like it's such a similar experience, even for myself and so many people I know, that we either, like my first trip was with my family, also dragged along when it should have been summer in Australia, and it wasn't even summer in Israel.
It's cold winter.
Yeah. And then, you know, going 2 years later, similar age to you with my school, and just feeling like I'm there for, you know, just to have, well, with the family, it was like, why am I being dragged here? And then with going with my school, and I'm just here to have fun. And there was, you know, also, I've just felt this like, and I didn't think it would happen. I thought it was a cliche that you would go to certain places and you would feel something. And it wasn't necessarily at the places I thought it would be, but there was just something about this country that I could not let go of. And in all the years that have passed since, and I've been back many times, like I said, reading your book and reading the descriptions takes me back to those really first times, and that feeling of like, there's no place, like I've never been anywhere in the world where I felt quite like I feel in Israel. And I just feel like that really resonated from your book as well.
Do you have a favorite spot that you love the most? When you're there, you feel the most alive?
That's a really good question. And the interesting thing is that for so many years, I hated Jerusalem. And I feel like reading your book made me think about a lot of things, because I always felt like it was too closed in, too busy, too like, it was like almost like strangling, you know, like claustrophobic. And I used to say, I get Jerusalem syndrome, or I can't go to Jerusalem. And we had years where we would visit Israel and not go to Jerusalem. And the last time we were there, we had such a beautiful experience, and we walked through the market in a different way, and the sounds. So I would say Jerusalem's one of them, but I don't really know. I can't, what would be, aside from Jerusalem, what would be your favorite?
That's a wonderful question. I love Akko, which reminds me of Jerusalem, except on Quaalude, it's really relaxed because it's by the sea. I love anywhere in the desert. I love being there and feeling that power. I love being by the sea. I love any market, whether it's in Ramla or Shuka Carmel in Tel Aviv, or in Haifa, any place where there's fresh produce and you can measure the rise and fall of the seasons based on what's rising and falling in the stalls. I like that. What you said about Jerusalem, before I began to re-explore Jerusalem, I had some similar feelings. It can be very overwhelming. And there were times when my favorite part about Jerusalem was the blue sign that says Tel Aviv in that direction. But that began to change as I began to get to know it better and on a deeper level. So I relate to what you're saying, and I'm glad you had a better experience the last time you were here. And when you come back, I'm going to take you around and we'll have an adventure.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask about that is, so what was the inspiration about writing the book, and about, you know, the idea of going to the four quarters? Like what made you want to go there? And just going back on, like, what I really loved about the descriptions is, like, when you talked about things like, there was one part where you just even talked about the sun rising in the morning over the Dome of the Rock, and something about the city, the colors, the way that the city turns, a pink and a gold. Like, it just made me want to watch the sunrise over Jerusalem, but also to see the sunrise over Jerusalem in different areas of the old city, which I, you know, haven't been to. And you also spoke about the layers and the way that Jerusalem is built on layers. And I would just love to hear more on, like, the way that those layers came to you and affected you and your experience with this magical city.
So during the first summer when I was in Israel, we spent a lot of time in Jerusalem. We went to the Kotel, we climbed roofs, we looked out over the old city, we walked through different parts of the old city, the markets of the old city, only in the Christian quarter, down from Jaffa Gate, down David Street, where we hooked right then, and then another left to get to one of the entrances to the Kotel. We only knew a small portion, but I loved what we saw. And I loved the scarves hanging from the metal doors. And I loved the clang of those doors in the morning as the merchants began to open up and start selling. And again, the smell of the za'atar and the fresh bread and the nargila, the hookah pipes, and all of that just felt so powerful. It evoked another time and almost had its timelessness to it, as it's like this scent of continuity from centuries ago to the present. Yeah. And so I loved all of that. And I also loved feeling that connection with my mom and with my family who had walked those streets and felt that love. But then on another trip, let me just take a step back and say that after that first summer, I was sold on Israel. I decided I wanted to make Aliyah, made myself a promise. I even promised the woman at passport control that I would be moving to Israel one day. And she looked at me and rolled her eyes, and she was chewing her Orbit gum or whatever. And she says, "No, everyone says that. Go back to New Jersey." I stood up straighter. I said, "I'm from LA." She said, "Oh, even worse. You're never going to make Aliyah." But I was determined to prove her wrong. And so I kept returning summer after summer. And then in the summer of 1999, I was volunteering on a kibbutz and spending my weekends in Jerusalem. And this was a really optimistic time to be in Israel. The nation was still reeling from the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin just a few years before, but there was still the sense that the handshake on the White House lawn between Rabin and Arafat actually meant something. And there was still kernels of trust there and hope, optimism, and a sense of possibility that any day there would be peace and we would be living together in some ways, side by side, with each other, separate in some ways, together in others, but we would make it work. And I remember one of those weekend nights, I was staying there in the old city, and I took a walk around the walls of the old city. And it was this warm, there was splendid, sultry night, and I found myself standing in front of Damascus Gate. Emily, have you ever seen Damascus Gate in person, or do you know what it looks like? It's like something out of a medieval fantasy. Yeah. Right? And so there's a colloquial Arabic expression for Damascus Gate, and they call it the gate of the opening embrace, the welcoming embrace, because it looks like the gate is reaching out to hug you. And it's got the little turrets, and the moon was shining, and I'm standing there having this Jewish American princess in ancient times fantasy by Damascus Gate on this warm night. And suddenly I feel this searing pain in the back of my head and my neck and my shoulder. And I reach back and I touch myself here, and I realize my hand is wet and sticky, and I'm covered in my own blood. And someone or someone's been throwing rocks at me. And to this day, I don't know why. I wasn't wearing anything that identified me as Jewish or Zionist or Israeli, but it didn't matter. I was terrified, and I was barely 18 years old. I hadn't even applied yet to university or taken my SATs, my end of high school examinations for college. And I went running through Damascus Gate. It was my first time exploring the Muslim quarter, and what a way to do it. Yeah. I'm injured, terrified out of my skull. All around me is this music in another language. There's smoke everywhere. There's shouting. There's cacophony of sounds. It sounds like they're gunshots. Now I know it was probably fireworks because it was the end of Ramadan when this happened, but I didn't know that. All I knew is I was light years away from high school, light years away from my mother and father and safety of my community. And I was all alone. So I found two border police officers who escorted me out of Damascus Gate, took me up to Jaffa Road, and I sat there and I cried and I swore to myself, that's it. I am never going back in the old city. It's not safe. Something can happen to me. I don't want to be there. And I kept that promise for a long time. But then 15 years later, I'm living in Israel now. I made Aliyah with my now ex-husband and our 2 children. And I was going through the rigors of divorce. We had separated by now, by this point. And I was working for Times of Israel, which is based in Jerusalem, right around the corner from the King David Hotel. And while I was working there, I still maintained my promise not to go in the old city, but I began working with a new colleague named Avi Issacharoff, who's the creator of the hit TV series Fauda. Yeah. Brilliant guy.
Yeah.
And this is before Fauda, but Avi was still and is still a superstar. He's extraordinarily charismatic. He's so smart. He's fluent in English, Hebrew, Arabic, and probably 6 other languages he hasn't disclosed. He smells amazing, by the way. Oh, sorry. And he said to me one day that he was going to interview one of the sheikhs, that a man of religious authority within Islam, up on the Temple Mount. And did I want to come and take some photos while he interviews this guy? Now, the Temple Mount is in the old city, clearly, but I somehow, faced with this dilemma, managed to convince myself that Avi would park by the Western Wall. We'd go in through security, through the Western Wall security. We'd be in the plaza of the Western Wall, go up through the Mughrabi entrance into the Temple Mount Plaza, and it would be fine. It would be a compromise. I wouldn't feel like I was in danger or really in the embrace of the old city, but I'd still get to spend the day with Avi and try something new. And I managed to convince myself, I'm single mom in Israel now. I'm making it work and I can handle this. So I agreed. And what did he do? He ended up parking all the way around the old city at the north side, right next to Damascus Gate. I got to tell you, muscle memory is a real thing. And I felt my stomach somewhere between my toes and my teeth, like I was going to be sick all over. I was shivering. Luckily, it was a cold day out, so I was able to pretend I was shivering from the cold and not let Avi know that I was terrified. And he didn't know about my experience at Damascus Gate from 15 years before. And so he doesn't think anything's wrong. We walk through the gate and he turns to me and he says, Yalla, let's go eat some kanafe. Now, I had no idea what kanafe was. But at this point, I can barely speak. And I'm just keeping my mouth shut so I'm not sick all over myself. And we're walking through the Muslim quarter to get some kanafe, which turns out is delicious. It's this baked cheese dish with rose water and these noodles on top. It's really good, and some cardamom. We sit at this place and my stomach is all clenched in this tight little rock. And Avi's there, completely oblivious. And as I begin to smell how good this kanafe smells, and it's warm inside the shop, I begin to look around. And I'm half expecting to see someone lunging at me or glaring at me or hissing at me or throwing something at me. And none of that happens. And some people aren't even looking at me. They're just eating their kanafe. So I take a bite and it's good. Finish mine and I finish half of his. We end up walking out of the shop. And as we're walking out of the shop, breath by breath, inch by inch, step by step, I begin to look around and I just see people. I see moms carrying babies. I see these dudes playing backgammon, who are crammed into these metal chairs, arguing with each other. I see pretty girls in hijab and the headscarf flirting with the guys behind the counter who are selling, all manner of wear. I just see people, and I realized how much I had missed by being afraid. And so I began to make this trek around the old city every few days. And first I would go with other people. I needed to feel the sense of protection. And then I started doing it on my own. I realized I could handle it. And one day the guy from the kanafe place comes out and he's like, all right, khalas, that means enough in Arabic. Who are you? You're always here. Are you bored? Are you a spy? You have to come and talk to me. So again, I felt like my heart back in my throat. What am I going to say to this guy? It was my first time sitting across the table from a Palestinian without a mediator and some sort of group setting. I went to University of California at Berkeley, so we had lots of these dialogue groups. But this is different. We're just 2 people sitting across from each other with our kanafe and maybe a cup of tea if I'm lucky. And I didn't want to offend him. I didn't want to make him angry. I didn't want to hurt his feelings. And I was also afraid of being offended and angry and getting my feelings hurt. I thought, we're going to talk about our differences. He's Muslim, I'm Jewish, I'm a Zionist. He probably isn't. But we didn't talk about any of that. We peeled back the layers of our own identities, and we talked about our families. We talked about our friends. We talked about his wife's rosemary garden, and how my son is into playing guitar, and how his kid plays soccer, and my daughter likes to draw. We talked about the things that make us who we are. And that conversation didn't change the world, but it led to other conversations and to the beginning of a real friendship. And that has been extraordinary. And that led to other friendships with other people, and learning how to find new inroads, not just behind our own personal closed doors, but behind the actual physical closed doors of the old city, to explore some of the physical dimensions of the place. Because you open a door in the old city, and you're not just in a room. Sometimes you are, but oftentimes you're in a garden with fountains. And one place in the Armenian Quarter is this giant tortoise that's about 80 years old, ambling around. You never know what you're going to find. And that's so true in the physical space of the old city, and also in our own emotional and psychological landscapes as people who live and love in the old city as well.
Yeah, I find that so interesting, especially like your dialogue with him, and just like, yeah, I think, you know, like the idea of like you can't be what you don't see. It's also like you can't understand what you don't know. And I think a lot of the time with like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the inhabitants of the city, a lot of it is like this lack of knowing the other. So, and if you don't know the other, then you can't, if you've never come across them, you can't understand what their story is and what their narrative, and the same is true for them not understanding our narrative. So that's, I found that really something special. And just also, I think for me, like reading the book and having not spent a lot of time in Jerusalem, it made me think as well about, you know, we also did a very similar, you know, going through the old city only through the places we could go. When I went with my school, we weren't even allowed to go to the old city on our own. Like all of my friends got grounded one weekend. I was the only one that didn't sneak off to the shuk because I was too scared. They didn't, and they got in trouble. We weren't allowed. So I didn't know about any of the other areas. And it was only till like, you know, probably 10 years ago now, something, I was in Israel, and I happened to be there with a group of sort of, I was with a group of people that were from Amena, which is like it's in Australia, it's like the parent organization of Habonim Draw, you know, sits on the left kind of thing, you know, small L liberal, social progressive, all of that. So it was the first time I'd been around where I'd been in a situation where it wasn't like a school environment or, you know, a set Jewish program environment. And they said to me, hey, let's head over to East Jerusalem, which I'd never been to either, and let's enter the old city through East Jerusalem, and let's go to all these different places. And one of the places which we went to, which you talked about in your book, was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Mm-hmm. And I didn't, to be honest, when we walked to, I didn't even know what it was called. Like, I'd gone in there and I felt like I was transported to another world, like so beautiful. And it's only when I got home, I Googled like a big church in Jerusalem and I felt so stupid.
Don't feel stupid. I did the same thing. Okay.
And isn't it just magical? Like, I felt like for anyone that hasn't been there, like the descriptions that you gave, like just gave it justice as well. It was like, and as you know, you mentioned before about not being able to smell, like to explain smells. And even just now thinking about that day I spent there, I feel like I can almost smell like the incense and all of that.
It is one of my favorite spots because of the sensuousness of being there. And I had this experience. I actually got to go in the middle of the night. I was staying in this, one of the places right off of David Street, a hostel, where the rooms had no windows. You took what you got. And I went to go take a shower, and I thought the door was locked, but apparently it wasn't, because this this Russian guy covered in prison tattoos came in. Now he was embarrassed. I was embarrassed. I came out in my towel, scurrying back to my room, and he approaches me and he's speaking to me in Russian. Now which I do not speak. My grandfather's family is originally from Belarus and from the Ukraine, but my understanding of Ukrainian or Russian or any language that's in that family is nil. Some Hebrew, some Yiddish, obviously, but that's it. But I'm curious enough to know what this guy is saying to me as I'm sort of dripping wet in this towel in the middle of in the middle of the old city in middle of the evening on a Friday night. So I downloaded Cyrillic script on my phone. I made him type what he wanted to say. We put it in Google Translate, and he was inviting me to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre's midnight mass. And so, okay, this is strange. But you know what? I have my pepper spray in my pocket. I'm going to do it. And so I did. And we entered the church. They locked the doors behind us, and it was full of people. It was the Greek Orthodox ceremony, and the patriarch was there and leading the service in Greek mostly, and then another priest prayed a bit in Russian. And I was there for about 4.5 hours. And at the end, we got some very nice, sort of, it tasted almost like whiskey, but not quite, and chocolate cake. So that was an experience I never expected to have, peeling back some of those layers of the old city and realizing that these buildings, which are by day often tourist attractions, are also functioning places of life, of worship, of just day-to-day reality. It's also like walking through the Muslim Quarter one night, late at night, coming back from Shuk Makana Yehuda, from my friend's restaurant, Crave Gourmet Street Food, great kosher food. They have cheeseburgers that are kosher, believe it or not. And hearing some baby crying in the middle of the night inside this holy space, and realizing, no, if it's just a colicky baby, and doesn't matter if it's a Jewish baby, Muslim baby, Christian baby, all babies cry. And here it was 3 a.m. and wondering how those parents were doing. So it's one of the things I like about it. There you have the holy and you have just the spectacularly mundane, all in the same place.
Yeah, I find that really interesting as well, because for many of us that have only experienced the old city as tourists, like I couldn't even imagine where the apartments are or where people live. Like, to me, it seems all just the touristy, you know, the little marketplaces, the little shops, the little restaurants, the little men selling Jerusalem bagels and crepes and whatever. And I've never
just look up.
Yeah,
they're all on top. Yeah.
That's the thing, Sarah. I've never thought to just look up in the old city. And like, I was like, where is that? And even you had a picture in your pictures, which were amazing as well. In the middle of the book, there was this picture of 2 kids standing, I think in maybe the Armenian Quarter, in front of a small soccer field with.
Exactly, like, yeah. That took me about 10 years to realize existed. I didn't know about that. And I've walked the ramparts, but where you can actually see it from the ramparts tour, but I've always walked on the other side, so I've missed it. And it wasn't until a friend took me through the Patriarchate, which is only open to Armenians or people who are brought in by Armenians, did I actually see this thing. And I couldn't believe it. There's an actual proper, measured correctly soccer pitch just within the walls of the old city. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. It's what you said about there's also the spectacularly mundane. Like, I just would never have imagined, but then where would they go otherwise? And there must be things there, it's not all just the Kotel and the churches and the Dome of the Rock. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about those places as well. Just also like how you had access to go to certain areas. Like, is it easy to be able to go to areas like, onto the Temple Mount and things like that? And also, yeah, I'll leave it at that for now, and then I'll ask my follow-up.
Well, the Temple Mount is tricky. And if you want to access the Temple Mount, I don't recommend trying to sneak in through one of the major gates that Muslims are allowed to enter. It's really, it's not safe. It's completely illegal, and it can also just stir up tensions because there's so much focus on this spot. and the piece of it balances on the pin with the angels. So you can go in through the tourist entrance of the Mughrabi, the western entrance, which is by the Western Wall. And that's when Avi and I went to visit the Temple Mount together. That's where we've been. And then the other times that I've gone in there. And I think I've actually only been there 4, maybe 5. No, I've been there 5 times. And if you're going, the best time to go is early in the morning, because unlike the later times, which have more tourists and often feel more tense because Muslim worshipers up there sometimes don't like when other groups come up. If you go early in the morning, you'll see there are fewer people there, and you'll see all these cats milling around the plaza near the Dome of the Rock, and you'll see the officials from the Aqsa Mosque and from the Dome of the Rock actually feeding the cats, and then these birds are flying around, and there's a quietness that I really like. But it's not one of my favorite places, because I always feel like I'm to some degree holding my breath, even in those quiet morning hours where the cats are roaming around, where it's very beautiful. But I feel so aware of our differences, and it's not a place where I've had any luck or have tried particularly hard to have conversations to bridge those differences, because there's so much symbolism and meaning for the beautiful and for the terrible steeped into that holy site. It really can be a flashpoint. So that's one of the few places where I feel that way. For the most part, I feel like I have the ability to go in and out of different places at ease. I dress accordingly. If I'm going into a church or a mosque or a synagogue, I will, I'll cover my shoulders and follow their dress codes. If I'm going into a Muslim space, I will cover my hair. Same with the church during religious ceremonies. If you're going in as a tourist, you don't need to cover your head. But during that midnight mass, I did, just out of respect. And the same is true if I go into someone's home. So if I go into someone's home and I know that their norm is to dress more modestly, I will do the same. But out in the streets, I'm going to be who I am. I don't pretend to be anyone other than me, for better and for worse. And it's worked out okay so far.
Yeah, and you didn't feel scared, or was it the fact that you managed, like that you were able to really talk to people and meet people and understand the people, that made you less fearful? Or, how does that all
Well, it wasn't all sunshine, rainbows, and eating kanafa together and talking about rosemary gardens. There were times that weren't easy, and there were some instances that were painful and difficult. A few are in the book, and one in particular I'll mention now. This was in 2017, and there were protests on the Temple Mount during the summer. And it started because Palestinian terrorists had stashed weapons on the Temple Mount, which to my knowledge really hadn't been done before, or at least in a very long time, came out and firing on the police officers who were standing by one of the gates. And these police officers were there to make sure that non-Muslims did not enter the holy site. That was their job, to actually protect the Temple Mount for the Islamic Religious Authority. And they were out there doing their job, and terrorists came out and shot them and killed these 2 young men. And so Israel shut down the Temple Mount, did a full weapon search, and then installed metal detectors and security cameras in front of all of the Muslim entrances. Now, there's already a metal detector and security camera in front of the tourist entrance. So, and also for those of you who've been to the Western Wall, you've also gone just to get onto the plaza through metal detectors and security entrances. And so from my perspective, I thought, okay, that's, why not? But then friends of mine in the Old City explained to me that who are Palestinian, explained that this was just one more indignity of having to live under Israeli control. And it was frustrating and hard for them. And so there was tremendous anger. There were protests around the Old City, and most of these protests were nonviolent. There were some clashes, outside of the old city in East Jerusalem, but for the most part, these were people who were praying outside the old city. There was chanting, and the chants were difficult to hear, but there was no one was throwing Molotov cocktails, no one was shooting. So I went down to see what was going on, not as a participant in the protests, but just out of curiosity as a journalist and living in the old city. This was part of the experience of the old city and the pain of the old city. And so while I was there by Lions Gate where these protests were happening, I saw people I knew and still know to this day saying things like, "With blood and fire will liberate Aqsa," and then another chant that reminds people of a massacre against the Jews by Muhammad's army, and then also the old "Stand by Death to the Jews." And I'm standing there, I'm horrified and heartbroken, and because I'm looking at these folks who I know, and just a few days ago we all ate hummus together, and there's another colloquial expression that if you eat hummus with someone, you can't kill them and they can't kill you. But they're saying this and they're looking at me and I'm looking at them and they see me seeing them. And I also know underneath that it's not about me. They're angry about something bigger. But still, it was hard for me to hear that and sit through that. And I remember as I left the protest, and it was really hot out, really oppressively hot out, I walked around the walls of the old city and I thought to myself, like, why am I even here? Well, one of the reasons that I was so drawn to living in Jerusalem is it's the hottest piece of spiritual real estate in the world. Okay, it's this center of obsession and love for three major religions, and yet we never see each other. We walk by each other. We're like rocks in a rock tumbler. We only interact during periods of stress, of violence, fear, and anger, but we don't ever, for the most part, see each other on a day-to-day basis in a human way. And I wanted to see if we could transcend that, or at least if I could. And so that is why I was there. And as I'm walking around, I think it's not working. This experiment's over. It's too painful. And I thought about going home and just calling it a day and not doing this anymore. But I ended up staying because just as my mom was stubborn when she put me on that plane and made me go to Israel, I was stubborn too. And I knew that we could get beyond this. And then just one day later, I'm walking up Via della Rosa and coming from Lions Gate, and I hear the sound of metal on metal. I hear shouting, I hear screaming, I can smell smoke from people's cigarettes, and I run toward it. Now, most people wouldn't do that, and I don't always advise this, but I was there again to see what was going on. And between the 6th station and the 7th station on Via della Rosa, there are all these men, and they're holding axes and they're holding hammers and they're banging on this pipe. And I'm just wondering what is going on. And this is during a time of fear and tension in the old city. And I turned to someone sitting by the pipe who I know named Omar, and I said, Omar Shuhada, what's going on? What are you doing? And he said, Sarah, you will not believe it. I said, okay, try me. No, you will not believe it. Come on. Okay, there is a kitten trapped in the pipe and we are trying to free this kitten. And all these men are banging on the pipe, and one of the men with an axe, a big axe, okay, not a little hammer, but like an actual axe. He's one of the guys I knew from the protest, and he's there swinging it. He's got sweat pouring down his face. His eyes are wide and deeply concerned. And meanwhile, like there's a priest and a rabbi and an imam all gathered around, and it's not the beginning of a joke. It's actually a rescue operation. And tourists are taking pictures, and there's this guy with a guitar singing something in Spanish about a cat, and all these different kids from the different communities in the old city have now amassed. Word gets around fast in the old city. If you want to keep a secret in the old city, don't bother. People know what you're up to, even before you know what you're up to. And with this like groan, the pipe gives way, and they pull out this teeny tiny cat that's no bigger than the palm of my hand, and its ears are folded over and its eyes are closed, but it's still mewing. It's alive, but it's so young that it can't even open its eyes yet. There's no mother cat around. There's no way for it to nurse. And so the man from the protest who had been saying such vile things picks up this cat and holding it like it's a sacred offering. And he looks around and he says, we can't just leave it on the street, it will die. And so then I remember that there's a woman inside the Jewish quarter named Tova the cat lady. That is her official name on her ID. And her job that she's given to herself is to walk around the old city late at night and lay traps to capture the different cats in Jerusalem, take them to the vet to be vaccinated and neutered and spayed and de-whatevered. And then she keeps the ones that are sick and she releases the ones that are healthy, but at least they won't be fruitful and multiplying anytime soon. So if never, actually. So I call her up and she answers the phone. Hello, she's from Brooklyn. And she says, no, what do you want? I said, oh, hi, Tova. We met a while ago. I don't need your life story. What do you need from me? Brooklyn. So I tell her that we found this cat in the Muslim quarter. It's a tiny kitten, too young to nurse on its own. And she says, well, it's not rocket science. You're supposed to feed it with an eyedropper every hour. I breastfed. I know what that's about. I'm not doing this with a kitten. So I tell her I can't, no one else can take the kitten. And so she sighs, this is fine, I'll take it. And so all of us from Via della Rosa, we walk down the street, make a right. We're walking now through the Muslim quarter, the priest, the imam, the rabbi, the kids from all the communities. Now border police officers have joined us. The guys who rescued the kitten, they've somehow managed to stash their weapons somewhere else. But we're all walking together to the Jewish quarter to bring this kitten to the Jewish quarter. And it was the first time I ever saw people looking at each other in this kind of way. They were all united to save one of God's creatures who was in this fragile, vulnerable state. Everybody together, the Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, in this sort of united path. And to this day, this kitten is still alive, now a cat, quite big. Its name is Mo, either Moses or Muhammad, depending on your persuasion, and living happily in the Jewish quarter. And this Jewish Israeli woman from Brooklyn knows that this cat was rescued by Muslim Palestinians in the Muslim quarter, and the Muslim Palestinians in the Muslim quarter know that the kitten that they worked so hard to rescue is being cared for and loved and tended to by this Jewish Israeli woman in the Jewish quarter. And people think I make up this story, because whenever I take trips around the old city, I tell the story. And then inevitably, after I'm accused of exaggerating or making things up completely, some guy who I don't even know if he was there that day will come up to me inside the Muslim quarter and say, Sarah, how is the cat? And I swear I didn't pay anyone to do this. But every time this happens, I say, thank God the cat is all right. Because even if someone asks me this question 40 years from now, long after the cat's been dead and buried, I'm still going to answer that, because that cat has to be all right. That cat represented something that happened, something wonderful that happened during such a time of stress and turmoil, and the possibility that it can happen again and again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
That's my very long answer to your question about.
No, I liked it, but if not to trivialize the situation, but if only it was that easy to solve the conflict. But I think that all of those little meshes of, like, as we talked about before, about talking to people and understanding the other, perhaps the more that we talk to people, the more we'll understand, which is my perfect segue, as I'm really conscious of the time, of moving on to your book of essays that I don't know if it's coming out soon or you're still writing, about taxi drivers. And I know that anyone that's on this line will know, every single person here will have a story about Israeli taxi drivers. So I would love to know your inspiration for this new book and whether you have any cool stories for us.
This book writes itself, and for all of you who've ever taken a taxi in Israel, you have this book in you too. You sit down, the taxi driver sighs. So you say, how are you? You don't want to know. I will tell you, but you don't want to know. And whether they're a Jewish taxi driver, a Muslim taxi driver, Christian, doesn't matter. They all have some kind of story, and some of them are funny, some of them are heartbreaking, some are just transcendentally beautiful, some are frustrating, and it's a learning experience. Each one is a learning experience. And I think the day I decided that there was actually something to it was when to writing this kind of book and trying to weave in these stories to reflect the complexity of Jerusalem, also of Israel. Many of the stories come from outside of Jerusalem. I do manage to take the road that with the sign that says to Tel Aviv. I do leave Jerusalem, once every 6 months. That these stories reflect some of the texture, the fabric, the identity, this shifting identity of this country. Because we're such a mixture of different stories. And so I'm sitting in a taxi one day and I've got one earbud in listening to Red Hot Chili Peppers. I'm from California, as I've said before, and that's my band. And the taxi driver is laughing. And I take out my earbud. I said, Mama Tzrik, what's funny? And he says to me, oh, that guy, and he points next to him to a taxi where another driver is wearing a kippah and he's waving. He says, that guy Menachem, he's so funny. He always makes me laugh. And I say to this driver, whose name is Mahmoud, which is a Palestinian and Arabic name, I said, do you all know each other? He says, of course we all know each other. He comes to break the fast for Ramadan, cheats on his diet when we're together eating. I go to his house for Hanukkah. I cheat on my diet when I'm with him. When his wife died, I came and sat Shiva. When my son was sick, he came to the hospital. Of course we know each other. And I said, what, do all taxi drivers know each other? He says, of course, it's how we look out for one another. Because at the end of the day, we all just want to get home. And I love that. That line too, it resonates with me to this years after I heard the story. And so that's when I thought, all right, there's got to figure out a way to weave these stories together, because I feel it's so true. And it's something I'm looking for as well. And I think one of the reasons why I seek out these stories and try to ask tough questions and explore is to figure out my place in this remarkable land and figure out my home as well.
And do you feel, Sarah, like after, your encounter with Israel your first encounter was over 20 years ago. You made Aliyah, Brent said, in 2010, so 11 years ago. Do you feel like you're home? Like where is home?
Home is wherever they have the best knafe. No, home is, that's a great question. I live with what I like to call mermaid syndrome, and Jerusalem is my home. But then I also know I'm an outsider here, and I never will quite fit in here. I'll never be truly Israeli. Yeah. And when I go back to the States, when I visit America, I can't return to being truly American and only American, because I've lived here and I've experienced here. So I'm both, and I feel the love and connection in both places. But Jerusalem is where I'm choosing to be home, and where I feel the most alive and creative and joyful, and frustrated too at times, and heartbroken, but just I feel that sense of possibility, and I love being part of this work in progress. And that's one of the things about living in Israel, and also about engaging with Israel, whether you're here on the ground or whether you're in Australia or the United States or Canada or Mexico or Japan or anywhere, where if you care about Israel and you're involved, you're not just watching history unfold, you're actually helping to create it. And that's, I think, just so marvelous. So I'm home here. I also love seeing my family back in the States. The sushi in LA is much better. I will tell you that. But the food, all the other food here is just phenomenal. And this is where I want to be.
Yeah, and your kids, they were born in
they were born in the United States, and they have not been back to visit yet. And I'm reminded of this quite frequently. Every time I dare to go and see my dad, I get the baleful looks from my children, and hopefully in the next year or two, we'll all be able to take a nice family trip. And,
yeah, I hope that
we'll get to see that.
I wanted to say that one of the things that you just were talking about, like sometimes feeling like an outsider in Israel, but then going home and feeling like an outsider, I feel like that's also like a shared experience. We've got a very big Israeli, like sort of expat community here. And even my husband, who's Israeli, I feel like when I was reading your book and you mentioned something about like similar to what you said before about, you know, feeling a bit like an outsider in both places, that's like exactly what his experience is like as well. And then I just wanted to talk about one of the things that you also said in your book, and I'm going to quote it here, but you said, I can speak Hebrew, I can spend the whole day in Hebrew, I can spend the whole day and even find my way back home again and order a fucking glass of whiskey in Hebrew, but I'm not smart in Hebrew, I'm not funny in Hebrew, I'm not interesting in Hebrew except maybe as a novelty. And I have to tell you, and I'm wondering if other people that have spent a lot of time in Israel that would resonate with them, because I just nodded along to that. Like that is exactly, and I can speak Hebrew fluently almost, and I can have conversations, but often when I'm in Israel, I feel like that exact same thing, that I'm not Emily in Hebrew, like it doesn't translate in Hebrew. So just thought I would mention that because it was just something that really resonated with the, you know, speaking another language, or, you know, conducting your life in a language that's not natural to you, or speaking, I don't know if you speak to your kids in English or in Hebrew, but just like that idea of, you know, having an argument in a language that's not your mother tongue and not being able to pull out the, you know, the big guns.
Exactly. Thank you for telling me that resonates with you. That makes me feel better.
I think you'll find that a lot of people would relate to that, and yeah, I just thought I would mention it. We're coming really close to the end of our time here, Sarah. So I just wanted to, I was going to ask you a bigger question, but you know, we talked about I think we already touched on most of it, but just about the idea of and this is really big for the 3 minutes we've had that we have left, but do you believe, or do you feel like peace might come between the Israelis and Palestinians? Do you believe, or do you think it's a pipe dream, or do you think it's a real dream that one day they will say, we understand each other's narrative and we'll find a way to live here together?
I have to believe it. Even on the days that are overwhelmingly frustrating and hard, where violence is boiling in the streets, I have to continue to believe it. And I think one of the surest ways to make sure that it does happen, and maybe not in our lifetime, but in our children's lifetime or grandchildren's lifetime, is knowing each other and being willing to listen to one another. Because even if leaders do get together and sign a peace agreement, and I don't see that happening anytime soon, but even if that were to happen, and even if that agreement were beautiful and just and noble and fair and perfect, unless we know each other and unless we're willing to live by that agreement, it's not going to mean anything. And the only way for us to overcome our fear of one another and our anger towards each other is if we are able to forge those connections. We can do that by just starting with one conversation. And as was the case with the guy from the Knafit place who wondered if I was bored or a spy when we sat together, our two eyes on each other's eyes, that first conversation didn't change the world, but it led to a second conversation and a third and a fourth and a fifth, where we began to understand each other. And that has become the basis for a real and long-lasting friendship. And from my experience, that is what's necessary for just and everlasting change.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Sarah, I'm going to hand us back to Bren to finish this up, but I just wanted to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for your generosity in speaking with us today and inspiring us all. And I feel like I have tears in my eyes of just this longing to get back to Jerusalem, and I've got your number, so I am going to be in touch when I come. And just thank you so much.
Can't wait to meet you in person, to meet both of you in person. Thank you for having me. This was just delightful. I love the questions you asked, and it's so interesting hearing your answers and your experiences as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And here's over to Bren.
Thank you, Em and Sarah. That was amazing. You know, we were discussing just before we went live that our international borders are finally opening tomorrow after about 18 months. And I think that you're going to have dozens of Australians knocking on your door over the next few months begging for a tour around Old City. I think, you know, your normal day work is going to be put on pause because you're going to have so many Australians bugging you, hoping to.
But you can't give away all the good places. That's the thing. Otherwise, there won't be hidden gems anymore.
They won't be good anymore. That's true. Well, look, our next ZFA conversation is actually going to be in just 2 weeks' time on the 14th of November. Our guest will be Dr. Eran Lerman, who is a former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor and now Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Eran and I will be in conversation about my book, The Challenges of Resolving the Israeli-Palestinian Dispute. It was published earlier this year and stitches together a grand theory on why the Israeli-Palestinian dispute has been so hard to resolve and what needs to be done in order to make peace possible. But I'm saying that after this conversation, I think if Sarah, you and I just walked around the old city stuffing kittens down drain pipes, I think that's got to be one way to engender peace in Jerusalem, at least. But look, I look forward to all of you joining us for that interactive conversation then. And until then, have a great week. Thank you again, Sarah and Emily, and good night, everyone.